honored guests, it's a great privilege and an honor to be here in Lviv. It's the first time I've been to Ukraine, the first time I've been to this very beautiful city. And it's the first time I've been to a country that is at war. And it is, for me, an interesting and very moving experience because you are coping with and adjusting to something which many people in the world don't have to adjust to. And you're living through it. You will one day be able to reflect on it from a distance, but at the moment, you are in the middle of it. It's also a great honor to be here at the Mykola Hayevoy Center, this wonderful collaboration between two great universities, and I think a very important collaboration indeed. I think it is important to try and understand what is happening as it is experienced, but you will also be trying to understand it in the future, and I think that is an extremely important endeavor. And so what is happening here to you is, of course, of immense importance to Ukraine and to Ukrainians. It is also happening in a wider context, and it's of importance to us all. I think this is not something that those of us in the rest of the world can afford to ignore. We are seeing the unwinding of an international order. We're seeing a challenge to an order which, for all its faults, has served us on the whole well since 1945. We've seen the challenge to a belief that territory should not be seized by force from one country by another country, that there should be no unprovoked aggression, and if there is unprovoked aggression, that aggression should not be rewarded. And I think so we are dealing with extremely important issues which matter for the world, not just for this particular part of the world. We're also seeing, I think, the changing nature of war. And you're seeing it, of course, in a very direct way. But for all of us, what this means, what the future of war will mean, is something that is being thought about every day. It is happening here. War is changing. I mean, in some ways, what I find extraordinary is there are pictures I see from the war that could come from the First World War. There are pictures of trenches. There are pictures of soldiers on the ground. But there are also weapons that have been converted from civilian use, such as drones. There are developments of new weapons, new ways of fighting. We're seeing, I think, more and more the importance of communication. We're seeing more and more the importance of technology. We're seeing great advances being made in the application of artificial intelligence to war, and this is something that is going to go on. And the future of war is going to be, I think, one which operates on a number of levels, both the level on the ground, but the level increasingly in new frontiers, the information wars, which have always been there as part of war, but I think are more important than ever before because of the power of social media. And of course, we're also seeing war moving into space. We saw in the 19th century war moving beneath the ocean. We saw at the beginning of the 20th century war moving into the skies. And we're now seeing war moving into space. And that is, I think, an absolutely terrifying prospect. We're seeing the increased use of autonomous weapon systems, and one of the great question marks that stand over war that we'll all be thinking about is, when does human control of war stop? We're already seeing the application of artificial intelligence in war, and so far there are not the ethical controls, there are not the legal controls over that application. Big states have been resisting using any attempts to control artificial intelligence in war, and I think we face a prospect that at some point it may simply get out of human control, that we may set in motion systems which can no longer be controlled by humans. This has not yet happened, but we face, I think, prospects of the changes in war, while we also see the very familiar face of war. And we see again what happens so often in wars is the penalty that civilians pay, that the civilians who are caught up in war, often not of their own choosing, simply because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, pay often a very dreadful price for war. This is, of course, not the only challenge that the world is facing. We have, I think, almost too many crises happening at once. People have actually invented new words for this. There is a word that political scientists are now using of polycrisis, a number of crises which overlapped, or a permacrisis, crises that don't go away. And so we have not just the unwinding of an international order, the changes in war. We also have domestic upheavals. We have formerly stable democracies now deeply divided. We're about to see in 3 weeks an election in the United States, and the results of that election are very unclear. And what that election means for the United States and for American societies is very unclear, because there are certainly among the Republicans large numbers of people, including their own candidate, who will not accept the results of that election if they lose. They're already preparing the ground for that. And so we're seeing what we thought was formerly a stable democracy. Yes, it had its faults, but it was a stable democracy with stable institutions and a shared set of democratic values. We're now seeing that country on the edge of something perhaps terrifying and different. We're seeing challenges to democracies in countries such as France, in Germany, in India. Possibly the United Kingdom has drawn back, I think, from the brink. The Labour government may not be a great success, but it is, I think, firmly committed to democracy. And of course, we continue to have global challenges. We have the challenges of mass movements of people. And again, I don't need to tell you about the challenges of refugees and what this can mean for societies. But this is happening in many parts of the world. We will have future challenges of pandemics. We got through the COVID challenge, but I think we should not be too complacent about that. We have the challenges of very powerful international criminal networks, which are increasingly disrupting civilian societies in formerly stable countries. And of course, we have the existential challenge of climate change, which faces us all, in spite of those who would deny that anything is happening. I mean, still, if I may go back to the United States, you have people sitting in Florida with the roofs blown off their houses saying there's no climate change. Now, there is a denial going on there, but climate is changing. Adam Tooze, the historian whom many of you may know, has said, as he's contemplated these various overlapping and simultaneous crises, he said, and I think he's right, the whole is even more dangerous than the sum of the parts. It's not just we add up the crises. In fact, it's the combination that is in itself so dangerous. So while we're dealing with these crises, many of which we are projecting into the future as we should do, why should we look at the past? Why should we turn at all to the past? What can the past do to help us understand what's happening today and what might happen tomorrow? I think the past can help us in a number of ways, not necessarily in ways of reassurance, but one key way, I think, is that it can help us to distinguish between what is new and what isn't. Not everything we're facing is new. Societies have faced challenges to their institutions and their values before this. We know that from history. And so we have to, I think, understand that history can help us not panic, that these crises can, not all of them, but many of these crises can be dealt with. I think we can also look at the past because it helps us to remind us, it helps to give us a sense of humility. We are not cleverer than people in the past. We don't do things better than people in the past always. That what we often do is worse, or we make mistakes. And I think by looking at the past, we can look at ways in which societies have dealt with issues, have dealt with problems, have dealt with them perhaps in ways that we haven't thought of. I think what looking at the past can do is help to remind us that there are different ways of doing things. There are different solutions to problems. What we can also do when we look at the past is be reminded that what we think has gone perhaps hasn't. And I think one of the things we thought had gone, and again, I think you here in this room will know that this was not true, but we thought, I think, since 1945, that the age of empire was over. That empires had gone, the big European empires had wound up. And we're seeing again empires. We see a Chinese empire in the making. We see, of course, a Russian empire. In many ways, Russia never ceased to be an empire. Other European empires disappeared. It did not. And we're seeing competition for control over parts of the world between the great powers. What we're also seeing is the reintroduction of the hereditary principle. And there are so many countries which claim to be base their ideology on communism, and yet they have hereditary leadership. North Korea, of course, is the prime example of this, where you have a series of people who come from the same family who claim by hereditary right the leadership of the country. But it's happening in other countries as well, which claim to represent equality, claim to represent egalitarian values, and in fact have established again the principles of hereditary monarchy. So I think we can use history to help us get some perspective on what is happening now, help us to think about it. We have to be very careful that it can't do everything. I think we have to be careful that history doesn't give us clear answers. There's too much history. You can find any type of history you want to justify what you're doing. It doesn't predict what the future will do, but it helps us, I think, to understand what we are and what others are. I think without knowing history, we don't understand ourselves very well. We don't understand where we came from, and I think this is extremely important. We need to understand how we got to be the way we are. But I think we also need to understand others, the others we deal with. I don't think you can understand, and I speak here very much as an historian, a political scientist would probably disagree with me, but I think you can't understand other peoples unless you know what their history has been. There's no way, I think, that we can understand why Russia is behaving as it is behaving today without understanding its history. What is it that Russia, and Russian leaders in particular, are remembering? What is it that they're thinking about? What is it that Putin is trying to rebuild? And I think if we fail to understand that, again, I don't need to tell you people in Ukraine that, but if we fail to understand that, we miss something very important. If we don't understand how it is that the Chinese leadership see themselves and see the world, then again, we fail something very, very important indeed. I think we also need to know and respect history because it does have, perhaps particularly today, a very strange sort of power. And I think it reflects the fact that in many countries, other sources of authority have gone. I think we no longer trust our traditional elites, perhaps with good reason. In many countries, not I think here, but in many countries, we no longer trust our religious institutions. In many countries, we no longer trust our political and democratic institutions. We no longer trust our financial institutions. But we seem to be thinking increasingly that history somehow is an impartial judge. I always worry when people say, history will judge me, or that history will one day, I will be on the right side of history. We give to history an authority, which I don't think it has. And so I think we have to be understanding of history, partly so we can be skeptical about it. And when people make claims in the name of history, I think we have to be able to challenge those claims. And again, I certainly don't need to tell you this, but I'm sure you've read, and I read a couple of years ago, the essay that President Putin wrote about how the Ukrainians and the Russians are one people. And that is very bad history. Again, I don't need to tell you this, but he apparently took it very seriously himself and thought that he had really discovered something. If I had been a teacher teaching him and grading that essay, because I'm extremely kind, I would have passed it just. I would have given it a barely passing mark, and I would have said, you have to do more research, you don't really understand history. It is a very bad essay indeed, but it's something that people take very seriously. And unfortunately, bad versions of history can be very powerful. What they can also do, as we know, is they can be used, the versions of history that are bad, that are powerful, that are not even well written, but often have a sort of power. What they can do is mobilize people. They can mobilize people to hate others. They can create a history which is a history of an enmity. Those people are not like us. They've always been unlike us. They don't belong. We must take them over. We must make them into something else. It was very dangerous before the First World War when you got a whole set of theories derived from Darwin, Charles Darwin, the great evolutionary scientist, applied to human societies, and you got learned people, professors, I'm afraid to say, talking about how certain peoples were bound to be each other's enemies, just as you had in nature, that the French and the Germans were each other's enemies. That was evolution. And that sort of history, I think, which helps to mobilize people around a false sense of their own past, often gives them a very one-sided and often glorified version of history, can be very dangerous because it often points to others as not being part of the history, not belonging, being enemies, being people who are worthy of less respect than the people who belong in our group. This type of history, I think, can be very powerful because it helps to create a group identity which excludes others, which doesn't allow for change, that our identity has always been attached to this piece of this particular piece of the world, or our identity has always been attached to this particular history. And I think this can be both powerful and very dangerous. And so I think we need to be able to challenge that sort of history because of the power which it has. I think our role as historians has not always been an honorable one. We have helped, some of us in the past, to create bad histories. We've helped to create histories, for example, in Germany in the 19th century, when you had historians who created a history of a German people who had been there since Roman times, unchanging, with unchanging characteristics. Or you had English historians who did exactly the same thing, creating a history of an English people who had always been one of the most advanced peoples in the world, who therefore had a right to their empire, therefore had a right to dominate over others. I've been reading Professor Hrycak's book on the history of Ukraine, which is, I mean, I'm sure you've all read it, but it is absolutely wonderful and full of information. But he has this wonderful phrase, which I may quote to you. While most people want to appear younger, every nation tries to appear older and tries to trace its origins to ancient times. And you have, I think in that book, you mentioned the claim that some Russian nationalists claim that they're descended from the Etruscans in Italy, which seems to me highly improbable, but obviously has a sort of power. And again, you get claims being made the other way around, that a certain people who claim a nationhood don't actually have a nationhood because you can't find any record of them in history, which seems to me, again, a very dangerous argument. And so I think part of what we do as historians, and we should do, is not be creating these sort of histories that go way back into the past. I always think it's a dangerous sign when people say, I can't prove this, but it's lost in the mists of time. It's lost in the fog of the past. If you can't find it, if you can't prove it, it's not true. And I think this is what we must do as historians. We are, in some ways, very awkward people to have around because we're always asking questions. You know, we're like the people who, if you go to a dinner party and you're talking about something and someone says, I got the train from Lviv to Kyiv on Sunday, historians are the people who say, no, you couldn't have done that because there are no trains on Sunday. You know, we are the awkward people in the room who say, no, that's not right. But I think that's exactly what we should be doing. We need to challenge because these histories can be so powerful, and we've seen, unfortunately, just how powerful they can be. What good history can also do, I think, is remind us not just of how to understand other peoples, but remind us that others are not like us. I think so often in the world we make the assumption that everyone reacts to the same sort of stimulus. Everyone is really basically the same. And yes, we are the same, of course, in our common humanity. But how we think, how we feel, what goals we have as peoples are often very different indeed. I'll give you one example, and I'm sure you can all think of many. But the Americans, when they went into Vietnam, assumed that North Vietnam would recognize that North Vietnam, was a very small and weak country, and the United States was a very big and powerful country. The United States had all the power. North Vietnam was tiny, smaller in population. What weapons it had came from outside. Those could be easily disrupted. The Americans assumed that the North Vietnamese would recognize this, and that as the price of trying to fight a war against the United States grew, they would recognize the price was too high, that it simply wouldn't be worthwhile. And what they failed to recognize was that the North Vietnamese were prepared to pay a much higher price than the Americans were prepared to pay. Robert McNamara, who was the US Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense at the time, and very much involved in the decisions that went into making that massive American intervention in Vietnam, said later on, he spent the rest of his life trying to figure out what had gone wrong. And he said, the great mistake we made was to think the North Vietnamese were like us. They weren't. They had different goals. They had a different timeline. There was a famous moment when the ruling circle, the inner circle in Hanoi, was talking about the war against the United States. And one of the members of the ruling circle said, we are going to have to fight for some time. And the answer was, yes, we fought the French for 7 years and we won. We can fight the Americans for 7 years or more if necessary, and we will win. And of course, that's what they were prepared to do. And the North Vietnamese leadership was prepared to take losses on a scale of its fighting people, but also of its civilians, that the Americans weren't. And this, I think, is a very good example of how history can at least help us to understand how those we are dealing with might react. I'll just give you one, another very short example, if I may. But when the coalition of the United States and Britain decided to go into Iraq in 2003, there were those who said the Iraqis may not like it. They tend not to like foreign invasions. And that was dismissed. The leadership, George Bush Sr., Tony Blair in England, both said, Iraq will understand that we are here to overthrow Saddam Hussein. We're here to liberate the Iraqi people. They will welcome us coming. And of course, the Iraqis didn't. The Iraqis had no great love, I think, in general for their dictator, Saddam Hussein, who had been a very brutal dictator. But they didn't particularly want foreigners coming in. And when the Americans and the British said, well, the Iraqis can pay for their own occupation, we will sell their oil for them, this simply confirmed the suspicion of the Iraqis that outside powers wanted to exploit them. And a massive rebellion started, just as it had started when the British tried to take over the territory that became Iraq at the end of the First World War. And they should have known. They could have looked back to that earlier invasion, when the earlier attempt by the British to run Iraq. They should have asked themselves, is this likely to happen again? And that's what I think history can do, and history can be helpful. It can help us to formulate questions. As I say, it won't give us very clear answers necessarily. It won't tell us what to do. But if we don't ask good questions, we don't have any hope of trying to find good answers. And so what history can do is say, if we do such and such a thing, what is likely to happen? And again, to go back to your own recent experience, and I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, it seems to me we will never perhaps know what the inner workings of President Putin's thought was, or what his inner circle was saying, and it's not clear that they were thinking clearly in any case. But if they had stopped to ask themselves, what are the people of Ukraine likely to do if we invade? What is the record of Ukraine? How have Ukrainians responded in the past to pressures from outside? They might have thought twice before invading Ukraine. We don't know, and we'll never know what their thinking was. But it seemed to me that what they must have been thinking was that it would be easy and they would not meet resistance. And I think if they'd known the slightest bit of the history of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, they might have thought twice. But again, I think it is often the temptation of great powers. They think power can overcome everything, that you don't need to know about history, you don't need to know about the differences between people. Your power is so great, you can simply fix things to suit yourself. It worries me too that some of our leaders don't seem to know very much history, because not only do they lack, therefore, the ability to understand other nations and other peoples, but they also lack the ability to formulate those sort of questions. Perhaps I'm talking too much about ex-President Trump, but he's, I think, on our minds at the moment. But I think he knows almost no history. And there is a story, which I believe is true, that he went to Hawaii, visited Pearl Harbor, which was the site of the great American naval base at the beginning of the Second World War, the place that the Japanese bombed with great success, which brought the United States into the war against Japan. And President Trump, when he was then president, looked around the harbor at Pearl Harbor, where you can still see a couple of the battleships through the clear water, and said, "So what happened here?" You know, this, I'm afraid, is a true story. And do you want the president of the greatest military power in the world who doesn't have any knowledge of what his country did in the past? And this, I think, is absolutely terrifying. You can see where my politics lie, I think. Like most Canadians, I'm a Democratic supporter. We have never been Republicans in Canada, perhaps with good reason. And so I think what history can do, and why I would like our leaders to know history, is it can help us. Warning, if you do this, you will get into trouble, or you are likely to get into trouble. Or do not think that your power can get you out of everything. Do not think that you don't need to understand other people. Do be careful, because you may make mistakes. Great powers in the past have made great mistakes. History is full of the examples of very powerful, very successful, very strong nations which have got themselves into terrible trouble. I think what also history, at least to me, seems to say, is that it is very important to have good leaders, especially in times of crisis. I think, for the most part, I'd rather live in a time when it doesn't matter who our prime minister is. You know, we've had a series in Canada of not very good prime ministers. For the most part, it hasn't mattered. And I'd rather live in that sort of society where it doesn't actually matter who the person in the prime minister's office is, because the institutions are strong enough, the values are strong enough, the bureaucracy is strong enough. But that's not always the case. There are moments of great crisis when you do actually want someone who can respond to that crisis. And I think the British were very lucky to have Winston Churchill in 1940. He was not a successful politician. If it hadn't been for the summer of 1940 when he took office, I don't think many people would remember him now. But he was the crucial figure at the time. He made it absolutely clear that he wasn't going to surrender. And he made it absolutely clear to the British people that they were going to fight on and that he was going to lead them. And I think that was extremely important. He wasn't always a great war leader. He often made mistakes. But I think the importance of him being there at that time cannot be overestimated. And I think one day, and again, I'd love to hear your views on this, you may feel the same about your President Zelensky, that he was there at the moment, and that if he had left Kyiv, as the Americans wanted him to do, things might have turned out differently. I mean, I do think, and you, please disagree with me because you know much more about it than I do, but I do think at moments of crisis, having a leader who you think will not run away, who will stay there, is a very important thing. And of course, we see it also what happens if you have leaders who are very bad. And I think we can't think of the history of the 20th century without thinking of some of the very bad leaders. I mean, it's not just impersonal forces, although that is important in history. Economics matters, ideas matters, resources matter, population matter, all these things matter. Some countries have certain advantages, other countries have disadvantages. But I think what matters at crucial times is who actually controls the levers of power. I think myself that the First World War might not have happened if you had had different people in office in Russia, if you hadn't had a very weak Tsar who was pushed around by both his wife and his generals, if you hadn't had in Austria-Hungary a very old and ailing Franz Joseph who was isolated and again was being pushed by his generals, and if you hadn't had in Germany a Kaiser Wilhelm II who was afraid of being called a coward and took Germany into the war partly because he knew his soldiers didn't trust him. And I think these things are important. I don't think we can understand much of the history of the 20th century without thinking of Stalin or Chairman Mao or Adolf Hitler. These people controlled very powerful countries, but they controlled them in ways that took those countries down dreadful paths. And they used that power. So that they are not just products of the system, they also took control of the system and moved it in certain ways. Stephen Kotkin, who has written what I think is possibly the best biography of Stalin, argues that none of the other Bolsheviks would have gone as far and persisted as long as Stalin did in collectivization and in the forced industrialization of Russia. None of the others would have paid that price. They would have pulled back, but he said Stalin did not falter. And I think with Hitler, other German Nazi leaders might have tried to make peace earlier. He was prepared to destroy Germany rather than surrender. And I think these things matter. Mao was prepared to push through his great leap forward and then the Cultural Revolution because he wanted to transform both China's economy and the Chinese character. And so I think we have to understand the importance of leadership. And we have to understand just how badly leaders can get it wrong. They make mistakes, they make assumptions, and assumptions can be very, very dangerous indeed. So I'm hoping that history will give us some, not comfort, but at least give us some ways of thinking about what we're dealing with in the present. At the moment, I think we're all questioning history, at least certainly those of us who do take history seriously are. What are the worrying things that history illuminates in our present day? And I think what we think back about history, what worries me about the present is the weakening international order I talked about earlier, but also the appearance again of great power rivalry, the possibility of conflict between the United States and China, for example. Increasingly, I find, I was in Washington recently talking to a group of mid-career military, and I noticed in the seminar we were having, they don't say if we fight China, they say when we fight China. And that seems to me a very dangerous frame of mind because they're assuming something is inevitable, which may not be. But if you start thinking that it is almost certain that the United States and China are going to fight. If both sides think it, which I think they are at the moment, then it's very dangerous, because they start seeing everything the other partner does, the other side does, as indication of their bad intentions. They start believing that if war is inevitable, you can see it coming. And I think that is very dangerous indeed. What we also have is the increasing pressure from revisionist powers, powers that don't accept the international order, which are prepared to break the rules. And I think this again is why the war here is so important, because if Russia gets away with the illegal aggression against Ukraine, then it will encourage others. It will encourage the Russians themselves, who have other goals in mind, but it will also encourage other powers that have territorial claims on their neighbors. There are a great many borders in this world that can be disputed. Virtually every border, if you really want to, can be disputed. And the danger there is the force of example. It happened in the 1930s when you had Italy and then Germany and then Japan, or Japan first, attacking its neighbors, seizing territory. It encouraged others to think that they could get away with the same. What I think we also have today, and we've had it in the past, we had it before 1914, is the reaction to globalization by those who have lost out from globalization. Not everyone has benefited from it, we know that, and we're now seeing an unwinding of globalization, and we're seeing populist movements based on resentment of jobs that are lost, jobs that have moved offshore, challenges from immigrants. I mean, again, I think this is a lot of the appeal of President Trump. And we had that before 1914, which was the other great age of globalization. And before 1914, we had those arguing for protection, those arguing against foreigners, blaming immigrants for loss of jobs, or blaming foreign businesses for loss of jobs. And I think what we also see today in democracies is a loss of faith in our institutions, increasing belief that there are conspiracies out there, that people are manipulating things. In the United States recently, there have been 2 dreadful hurricanes, and the emergency relief workers have been threatened. These are American federal workers who are coming in to try and help the areas that have been very badly hit. And people with guns have been saying, "Get out of here." And this, I think, is extremely dangerous. No longer trusting in your own institutions, no longer trusting in the abilities of democracies to deal with multiple crises, believing that what we really need is strong government. And we have seen, alas, this before, and we're seeing it again. There are a great many challenges now, I think, that we're facing. On the other hand, I think it is always wrong to despair that we have in the past come through some of these crises. We have the capacity possibly to do it. We need to be aware of what the problems are. We need to be aware of what crises we are facing. We need to, I think, use the past in ways that can help us, not let it trap us, not let us thinking today is exactly like this particular moment in the past. The analogies can be very dangerous. We mustn't think that just because something looks similar to something in the past, it's going to turn out the same way. And I think if we assume there's nothing that can be done about the crisis of democracies, nothing that can be done about the failures of democracies, nothing that can be done to rebuild the international liberal world order, then we are part way to accepting that some dreadful form of change is going to happen. So I think we need to look at the past, use it to help us understand the present, use it to help us ask questions about what is happening as we think very seriously about the future. I think we should all hope that our leaders realize that and will read a bit of history, and institutions like this new one will actually help to educate them in the history. And perhaps remember the words of the Italian philosopher Gramsci, who said that he has pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the spirit. And it's not a bad way to try at least make some sense of it. Let's not delude ourselves that the world is a happy and perfect place, but let's continue to be optimistic that it can be better. Thank you.